Welcome to the Act Out Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Tomlin. Today's guest is Robert Mahoney. He is the founder of TVTP Solutions. It is a behavioral threat assessment. It was a phenomenal conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Roll the tape. As soon as I saw your information come up, I was like, I've got to talk to this guy.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I was kind of telling you a little bit earlier before we started, but my dad was a police officer for 30 years. And so growing up, he would take interrogation classes. And then, like, as soon as he would get home, like, I would basically sit underneath him, like, tell me everything that you learned, please. So very, very excited about this.
Yeah, he'd try his interrogation techniques out on his children. That's
Yeah. I mean, I definitely confessed to a few things that I had no business confessing to. That dang read technique, I hate it.
yeah.
So how did you get started? And I'm sorry, I need to backtrack a little bit. What is it that you do?
So what I do is I run a company called TVTP Solutions. So it's an acronym that stands for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Solutions. And so I work with law enforcement. I work with mental and public health agencies. I work with school districts, along with some community programs, houses of worship, things like that. And I teach them prevention, the signs to look out for, how to establish prevention networks, what a prevention network looks like, what behavioral threat assessment, which I'm probably sure we'll get into later on in this interview, what that entails, what that actually is, and really trying to connect all of these different sort of sectors within the community to create sort of a concept of care rather than a system of care. And so that's what I do sort of on a day-to-day basis when I'm not going out there and spreading the word of prevention on people's famous podcasts.
Well, it's kind of, I was going to ask you how you got into the field, but I imagined that you saw a huge gap in everything that you were talking about, how there is basically no communication in between the groups to actually be able to get anything cohesive done. Is that kind of what you saw?
Pretty much, yeah. So I come from an emergency management background. So 20 years ago, 2005, Katrina happens, and I get inspired by sort of like the cascading problem solving aspect of emergency management. And I started working with local towns, states, all the way up through, some federal programs and things like that, mainly on prevention and preparedness for natural disasters. But then, as we've all seen, just a rapid acceleration of sort of targeted violence shootings and things like that. And after every single attack, I would hear, the police officer or the governor or somebody talk about how, have to admit that, yes, this person was on the radar of mental health, or they had issues, growing up with the school district. And there were plenty of people who had reported concerning behavior about this individual to the police, but the system wasn't designed necessarily to be proactive. And so I looked at that and started saying sort of the same sort of thing, because we've all grown up in the see something, say something culture sort of after 9/11, and began to realize that we didn't have a reporting problem, because you don't get put on these sort of watch lists and get notified if you have a reporting problem. What we had was a coordination problem. And the systems, whether it's law enforcement or it's mental health or even with school districts, operate on sort of a threshold response sort of framework, where some sort of threshold needs to be crossed in order for them to sort of act. And so with law enforcement, you could report somebody. If they're not doing anything illegal, there's not a whole lot that law enforcement can do. You contact mental health. Are they a threat to themselves or others? Well, no, not yet. Well, then get to the back of the line, because I've got X amount of people that can address this issue, and I've got thousands of cases, and we're just going to have to triage this. And then schools don't really like to they have their own internal processes and sort of try to keep things more in-house for a lot of different reasons. And so they are often usually calling mental health or once that threshold, once their resources are sort of like overblown.
Mhm.
And so I realized, as you sort of said, there's a huge gap in that coordination, but also in the methodologies of what we're doing.
Mhm.
And so the real hook for me was sort of coming to this realization that like no targeted violence is, or no violence in general, is a random act. Because I kept
Mhm.
hearing like we are falling victims to random act of violence, or this was a random act
Mhm.
of violence. So I began to really do some research on that and came to find that there actually is a very defined process by
Mhm.
which people, irregardless of what their motivations are, whether it's, religious or political or, a combination of both,
Mhm.
they follow a very scientifically proven process that gets them, sort of called the pathway of violence, that gets them to the point where they feel that committing an act of violence is sort of like their only way out. And there's a
It's
lot of
Oh, sorry.
psychological sort of things that go into that process and a lot of different types of events. But that's
So
really,
oh,
yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that the pathway to radicalization is the same, regardless of whether it's gonna come from a political lens or from a religious lens, whatever it is, those steps are actually identical regardless of which
Correct.
way you're being radicalized.
Correct. And so, we've touched on radicalization, or you kind of have to be radicalized first.
Mhm.
Now, there are people that are radicalized, but who do not believe that sort of violence is the answer, right? And
Oh,
so we want to
really?
make that
Okay.
distinction because,
Mhm.
we don't want to, and this goes a little bit dovetails sort of into behavioral threat assessment, where we don't want to take our own biases and our own preconceptions and profiles that we have and narratives that we have in our own heads and
Mhm.
sort of impose that on somebody that doesn't sort of have any intention of doing sort of violence. And oftentimes what you'll see even from family members or the general community is they sort of push it to the background, right?
Mhm.
They will isolate that individual. There's a weird thing that we do just from a human perspective where if you see somebody who is struggling with addiction or with depression or something like that, there's a tremendous amount of empathy
Mhm.
that we display for those types of people. There's almost like a helplessness kind of thing that we put
Yeah.
on those people. As soon as you start putting on sort of like the tinfoil hat and start ranting and raving about certain things, we don't look at that as a sign of help. We look at that as a sign of like, you need to get that sort of away from me.
Mm.
And that's one of the hurdles, the psychological hurdles
Yeah.
that I train, people in, is to sort of look for those indicators, those behavioral indicators that might show that somebody is struggling.
Yeah.
Right? And it's okay to be weird. It's not okay to be struggling. And we're totally fine with people kind of having their own grievances and popping off and having their freedom of speech
Mhm.
and believing what they want to believe. But there does come a time where the behavior starts becoming concerning, and
Yeah.
you realize that there is somebody there that actually needs attention and needs to have some type of discussion as to what sort of these motivators are. And really
Mhm.
what sort of boils down to are sort of three key pillars that we all sort of search for in everyday life. So the human brain it does not accept not knowing who we are, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
we have to have a defined identity. We have to have a defined purpose, a community, and sort of all those three things kind of wrap around each other. And what we often mistake as people believing sort of the more radicalized ideas, and is that they believe wholeheartedly in the message, instead of the intangibles that come with the message. So for instance,
Mm.
you know, neo-Nazism, okay? I may not necessarily agree with everything lockstep
Mhm.
in that, but it provides me with an identity. I'm able to talk to people, whether it's online or in
Mhm.
these meetings and things like that. That's my community. And then my purpose is this, right? Same sort of thing on the complete other end of the spectrum. If you go to like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, right? You go up,
Mhm.
say, "Hi, my name is Rob and I'm an alcoholic." Boom, you've got an identity. All the people that are around you, that's your community, right?
Yep.
And your purpose, they're there and you're there to support them, right?
Mhm.
And so those intangibles keeps you sort of locked in. And within the human brain, because it has to know what it is,
Mhm.
even if it's a destructive behavior or if it's a destructive pathway that we're going down,
Yep.
it's almost too much for us to bear emotionally and psychologically to break off that sort of magnet
Mhm.
and be sent adrift and
Yeah.
try to find something. And so sort of on the back end of a lot of my consultations and stuff like that, taking that and then going, okay, then how do we off ramp these people? Right?
Yeah, exactly. So the three things that you've talked about, humans need identity, they need community, and they need a sense of purpose.
Correct.
So I am assuming like what is step number one to stop that radicalization? How do we? I'm assuming, do we have to help with a sense of identity for folks?
So there's layers to it. So one thing that you have to understand is that all three of those are interconnected.
Mm,
And so if you can lead with one, the others will sometimes follow. Okay.
interesting. Okay.
The second part of it is to not think of it as an intervention. Okay. In an intervention, there is a power dynamic, which is sort of top down. Okay.
Hmm.
You're going to the person and you're saying, you're doing this destructive behavior. We're going to stop it. And I'm going to become in control.
Uh-huh.
Now, with radicalization and everything like that, there's a little nuance there where because I've attached my identity and my friends and my community and my purpose are all there, when you take that top down approach towards trying to, off ramp these individuals, they take it as a personal attack.
Yeah.
And you actually have the counter effect that you're trying to do, where I will actually, because I feel that you are attacking my just who I am,
Hmm.
I'm going to dig in my heels even harder. And so we try to um, intervene with facts
Okay.
or with arguments or debates and things like that. Those types of logical steps don't move the needle at
Exactly.
all.
Hmm.
So what
It's
you have
counterintuitive.
it is. It's very counterintuitive. And so what you have to do is you have to appeal to the emotional side. And part of doing that is having a negotiation rather than an
Hmm.
intervention. And what you are trying to do is get the individual to sort of break that hold themselves while also presenting other communities, other purposes, other identities that they can then switch over to. And
Hmm.
the idea being that, people are only as faithful as their options dictate. So
Hmm.
you want to provide a different option for them without them getting any kind of punishment for doing so, right? There has to be a level of empathy and understanding. And think of this more sort of, I go negotiation. It's kind of like a hostage negotiation.
Okay.
And you should think of it as such, right? We don't do an intervention for a bank, hold up. We
Hmm.
do a hostage negotiation. It's the same sort of thing. Why don't you come out and why don't you talk to us? Why don't we decide on different ways in which we can both, get what you want and we can get what we want and everything else. And eventually through different, negotiation techniques and strategies, you can actually get that person to do what you want to do
Hmm.
and they're the decision maker. and they
Yes.
feel that they have actually some control over where they're going. And that's really sort of like when it boils down to really one specific thing that you're trying to do, you're trying to showcase to them that they have some sort of control
Yeah.
over where they're going.
Absolutely. You touched on really one of the biggest things for me, and that is if you want to change somebody's mind, you have to touch their heart first.
Yes.
And actually, one of my previous episodes, I sat down with somebody from Colonial Williamsburg who he is Patrick Henry. So whenever if you're in Colonial Williamsburg, you see him. That's Patrick Henry, and he and I were talking about like giving speeches and how do you change people's minds. And at one point, he said, like Thomas Jefferson came up to me after a speech and said, "I have absolutely no idea what you said, but it was the best speech I ever heard." And what we had like realized is like, well, because you weren't talking to his mind, you were talking to his heart.
Yeah.
And that's how you're actually going to change someone's mind.
Yeah, and every decision that we make is based on some type of an emotion
Hmm.
or some type of experience that we have had
Absolutely.
that brings it in. And I think looking broader into the security field, one of the other gaps and fall points that I think people within the security field have is that they try to impose rational thinking
Hmm.
to behavioral issues.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is, the hardening of sites. And I've really kind of gone with this sort of another sort of three-pronged approach where if you want true security, most of the emphasis and sort of value that people sort of gravitate towards are within the protection or the preparedness/response elements.
Hmm.
More cameras, hardening of doors, card swipes, bulletproof glass, et cetera, et cetera. More
Hmm.
people, more security guards, armed security guards, people with military gear now and all this kind of stuff. Sort of like this over, constant escalation of sort of this outward, almost daring, like, don't even try it kind
Hmm.
of kind of security. And then you have preparedness and response of, we're going to do our active shooter drills, or we're going to try and have evacuations and everything else. There is value to that.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that prevention should supplant that, but there needs to be a balance. And in
Yeah.
order to have really good, effective security, you need a proper prevention strategy along with your protection and along with your preparedness. Because in the prevention side, the prevention can be very more emotional and narrative based. And I think when you go into the protection and preparedness realm, the narrative is not always the narrative that you are trying to achieve. And the best experience personally that I've had with that is I went to a liquor store years ago in a neighborhood that was transitioning,
Hmm.
and I'm going up to the liquor store and I see the CCTV cameras and there's cages and bars on the door and there's like a huge fluorescent light and there's a steel door, and I go through a metal detector and then I have to get wanded by a security guard, and then there's bulletproof glass floor to ceiling, and you have
Hmm.
to, do all of your commerce through a drawer and everything else.
Must be some really good liquor.
Well, that, you know what? And that's kind of the whole narrative was like, okay, this is the most secure place I've ever been, but I've never been more scared in my entire life,
Hmm.
because the narrative wasn't, oh, look at all of these security measures, look at how safe I am. It was, what the hell goes on here,
Right.
that they felt the need to have all this
Yeah.
stuff, right?
It's easier
And
to get in a courthouse than it was that liquor store.
exactly. And so I think there's a huge psychological narrative gap
Hmm.
that happens, and by bolstering sort of your prevention methodologies and having at least somewhat of a balanced value
Right.
across it, you actually get way better security from it than if you were to just go sort of the logical route
Right.
of a defensive posture of we are going to put all this stuff and, roll the dice that something, that all this stuff will somehow protect us in the event of an attack, even though we know that there's a guy down the street that everybody's concerned about, and we're not being proactive in getting that individual some help.
Hmm. Do you have any kids?
I do.
Okay, so I have a 2-year-old,
Okay.
and they the easiest age in the world to parent. But I've noticed that whenever he is very upset, um, and he's like he's about to throw something, be very very angry, I I would try to be like, Camden, you shouldn't do this, and then like would try to be as logical as possible, and he would just like scream and throw and do whatever, and it did absolutely nothing for behavior modification. But if I kinda give him a little bit of space and let him kind of get that out of his system, once he gets regulated, I can talk to him on a more, like, on a more logical side because his brain has switched and it's like, "Hey, I can, I can talk now. I've got my prefrontal cortex working again." So, it seems like we kind of go in with our prefrontal cortex when people are using their amygdalas.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And there's all kinds of, marketing from the commercial side that looks into sort of like these behavioral economics and different types of, even down to there's a huge section I do in some of my talks about Starbucks.
Mhm.
And, at its peak, there was a Starbucks opening every 6 hours somewhere in the world. And you don't get to that kind of saturation by just sort of selling sort of overprocessed coffee, right? Like
Yeah.
there's way more intangibles that come with it. Starbucks did things like rework their duct system so that it would blow um, the oven exhaust onto sort of like their seating area so that you would smell
Yeah.
the croissants being warmed up and everything else. They commissioned a different type of coffee maker because one of the things that was a main goal of them was to sort of mimic European cafe culture. So they wanted people to hang out, have a conversation, and talk. But there was a problem where the coffee machines were so loud that you couldn't have a conversation. So they had to find a decibel level and commissioned a completely different type of coffee maker that was loud enough that you knew your coffee was being made, but wasn't loud enough that you could still hold a conversation. And that kind of granular detail
Mhm.
in knowing that is going to elicit a psychological and emotional response that is then going to lead to you
Mhm.
your behavior wanting to buy something is something that I think is just a huge gulf
Yeah.
within the security realm. And I'm a big proponent of really looking at, as you can sort of see, I've got the map of Rhode Island. That's is where I'm based out of. So I have the luxury of being next to RISD, which is the Rhode Island School of Design,
Okay, yeah.
which is a college that does a lot in terms of marketing design, but also
Mhm.
architectural and things like that. And I've worked with them off and on trying to develop sort of a study on how do we design spaces with security in mind.
Yeah, I was literally about to ask you, how do we create a Starbucks of safety? So
Right. And so, not necessarily going out and having to redesign every single school or office building or anything like that. But there are certain things, whether it is the lumens of a light, if we can go from 3600 to
Mhm.
2700, sound deprivation, all right, in cafeterias and common areas and things like that to bring the noise level down. Things like the paint on a wall, right? Instead
Mhm.
of white concrete over concrete on a hallway, if we can find a sage green that is a certain hue
Mhm.
and measure the amount of sort of almost in a feng shui kind of way,
Yeah.
where you are measuring people's behaviors and also levels of anxiety and everything else to then apply those from a security perspective.
Mhm.
The idea being that with security, you are trying to find the abnormal, the people that are outside, the outliers,
Mhm.
outside of that bell curve, right? You can't do that if there's a lot of noise. And so what you're going to try and do within your space is try to make that water basically as still as possible so that you're able to see what's causing the ripple.
Mm.
And
I like that analogy.
yeah, and if we apply that to sort of prevention work and sort of the idea of violence prevention and behavioral threat assessment, I'm not a huge proponent of the term behavioral threat assessment. I think it has a narrative to it. While I fully am on board with the application of it, I
Mhm.
think people get confused as to what goes into the assessment, what type of information goes into it. And
Mhm.
I think people, when you have threat, people begin to not look at those one-off, seemingly innocuous incidences that actually, on a holistic, in its totality, are actually building the blocks of
Mhm.
somebody heading down. You wouldn't go to a threat assessment team if, you had a classmate whose grandfather died. Right? Or you wouldn't go to a threat assessment team if somebody broke up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, or if they decided to quit the soccer team or something
Mhm.
like that, right? Those aren't threat related information nodes that really, from a behavioral threat assessment standpoint, you would bring to that team.
Mhm.
However, that might be a singular point in a bunch of other
Yes.
points that is bringing somebody, that is setting in motion sort of a spiral downward. And by taking your attention and looking at what is causing the ripples, or oh, there's a ripple there, let's give that a little bit of attention, or let's just check up on it, or let's just see how they're doing, sort of thing. You can People will want to talk about their grievances. There's a section within my consulting that I do where I just let people for 90 seconds just go off on one thing. And it's amazing how easy that is for people to just do, right? And
Mhm.
just talk to the person next to you about a grievance that you're having or something that's bothering you. And what it does is it just levels the playing field of like everybody's got something, right? And everybody wants to just get it off their chest. And so the assessment comes with, okay, how are all of these different incidences, or how are all these things related to your behavior? Is your
Mhm.
behavior, are you spiraling sort of downwards? Are you pulling away from from society at large, right? Are you becoming more agitated easily? Is your banter and things becoming more escalatory in their nature? Are you becoming more threatening, et cetera, et cetera? And again, we seem to have this kind of threshold mentality where schools don't want to activate anything until all of a sudden I post on Instagram with two guns and say,
Yeah.
tomorrow's the day, right? And now everybody's like is running around and calling, and we're suspending, and we're getting everything in motion, and we're causing all of this stress, not realizing that we've had 6 months, six
Mhm.
years of runway leading up to this point, and trying to sort of thread this security needle of between threat to attack, expression of threat to attack,
Mhm.
rather than looking at everything that happens sort of left of
Right.
boom, right, is kind of the stumbling block for just the way in which we've sort of designed these systems.
So you teach people, or you teach these kind of like the institutions and the systems to look at the patterns of behavior beforehand. So the goal is we don't want to have to even get to an Instagram story, right?
Yeah, we don't even wanna have to like, to in my sense is if you've gotten to the point where a threat has been expressed, which is one of the stages when we talked about the very, scientifically proven stages of sort of the pathway of violence.
Mhm.
Expression and outward expression, broadcasting of a threat is one of those steps. If you
Can
have
you
got
please go through those steps?
so it starts with grievance, it moves to planning, it then moves to sort of broadcasting or acquisition,
Mhm.
is sort of in the middle, and then broadcasting, and then you have the actual attack. Now,
Mm.
those stages sometimes can overlap a little
Yeah,
bit, but for the most part, they are going to follow those steps. Now,
and that I'm
there's no
sorry.
timeline on
Mhm.
those either. So that grievances can it's not like you just wake up, get cut off on your way to work or school or something like that, and you decide to pop off, right?
Right.
The there is a death by a thousand paper cuts that sort of happens through this whole thing, right? And there's reinforcement. So you might have a grievance and then something happens during your planning stage which reinforces that grievance, and then you decide to plan for something
Mhm.
else, or, right? But you are going to follow that pathway of grievance, planning, acquisition, broadcasting, and then your attack. Now, there is a rule of thought that the broadcasting area, and even through the whole pathway of violence, that the escalation in behavior is actually your subconscious trying to get the attention
Mhm.
of everybody else that you need help.
Yeah.
Um, you see this with people who have suicidal ideation a lot, where they will broadcast their intentions of, you know, seeing who's gonna come to their aid,
Right.
and see if anybody cares, and then when nobody does, they harm themselves. Most people who do carry out targeted violence now have some type of suicidal ideation associated with it, where they are either going to kill themselves after the event or they expect to be killed during the event. And so given the intertwining of sort of violent ideation and suicidal ideation, there is the belief that because the subconscious can't, the emotional part of our brains, that because they can't really speak, they
Mhm.
speak through our behaviors.
Mm.
And the escalation of the behavior is actually our failed attempt at trying to call for help.
Yeah.
And because, like I said earlier, we don't have the same empathy, right,
Mhm.
for people who sort of have what we would call like the tinfoil hats and everything else, we often isolate those people, which just sort of compounds that downward spiral.
Mhm. Uh, I think so. I practice something called internal family systems, or IFS therapy, where it talks about you having parts. You're not. It's not just like a one mind. You have like parts. So if you're like part of me is really upset with mom, that's just one part of you. It's not the whole of you. Uh, and one thing that I learned is I pushed down anger for a very long time. And, what would happen whenever I would do that, it didn't go away. It kind of felt like it subsided at the moment, but all it did was kind of fill up my teapot a little bit more. And so the next time I got angry, I wasn't just reacting to one situation, I was also reacting to that other situation
Yeah,
that I never regulated myself for.
right.
So it makes perfect sense to me that, it's these, it's the subconscious, or it's these parts like screaming for help, like, "Hey, please see me. I want to be heard," but they're being ignored and pushed down.
Right. And that's everything kind of interplays with everything. So, the identity, the community, the purpose, the way in which we were going to off ramp everybody by giving them different options in able to find that control and things like that. The whole pathway and that as well. Sort of I think one of the things you had touched on, I don't know if I answered it correctly, was, a lot of my work when I go out and I talk to these different entities and these different sectors and things like that, what they classify, what they are allowed to know about an individual, whether it be through HIPAA or FERPA laws and things like that we want to be sensitive to. But even something like with schools, they will categorize different behavioral issues in different systems oftentimes. So they will have, certain Title IX infractions will go into one computer system or one computer file, and only a certain amount of people will have access to that. And then there will be other things that are in just sort of like a general file or, a third database. And there's all these different gatekeepers. And, police reports, those don't often get shared. Mental health reports obviously aren't going to get shared. So the idea going into sort of this fighting between the system of care of what is the system designed, how is it designed, and how is that information stovepiped to a concept of care of, okay, how can we coordinate our resources amongst all three of those sectors with the information that each of you sort of has or doesn't have to find out where we can sort of coalesce resources to get that individual some help. And that often takes going outside of that sector, right?
Yeah.
And so when we look at sort of a whole of community approach, we're bringing in, I've had success stories of bringing in bus drivers at school districts to threat assessment teams.
Okay.
For the purpose of identifying threatening violent behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But what we ended up getting was information about, this student is getting dropped off or picked up at a different stop than the other, and finding out, they're doing that because there's some substance abuse that's going on at the house. Or I saw a kid show up at the bus stop and their car looks like it's filled with, pillows and mattresses and things like that. Finding out, their family got kicked out of their apartment, right? Nothing to do with violence.
Yeah.
Right? Like nothing to do with violence. But in the idea being that you are taking a proactive preventative approach. That situation, if left to fester, could lead to other unfortunate events down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead and be proactive and do that. Reaching out to those different community groups, whether it's veterans or religious groups or departments of recreation. Departments of recreation are great because they see kids as well as parents in a completely different dynamic than the school would, right? Or that, their everyday life would be a little bit different. So they get a lot of information. Again, we're not looking necessarily, this isn't sort of like Tom Cruise Minority Report. I'm going to scan your eyeball and get this full length thing of like all the things that you're doing wrong. What you're doing is you're just trying to assess behavior. Are there issues, as minor as they may seem, because we talked about how everybody's got something that's irking them. How deep is that cut? And what do we have to do? Is it something just as easy as a quick conversation, a 1-minute conversation? Is it something of putting them in contact with a program or a person that helps out with that? Is it a veteran that just needs another veteran? Is it somebody of a certain religious
Mhm.
affiliation that just needs to find somebody that's similar. Again, going back to trying to fill those buckets of identity, community, purpose, right? And
Yeah.
trying to make people feel as though they're not in isolation. And that really is, if there's one key sort of predictor of potential violent behavior, it is really isolation. All those individuals that have carried out
Mhm.
attacks, they are not the life of the party. They are the people that nobody invites. Okay, they
Mm.
are the people that have separated ties with friends, family, society in general, and the only thing that they are fixated on is their grievance and the community that shares
Yeah.
in that grievance.
I think that it is incredible that we're talking about prevention of violence, and you didn't say a single time in anger management class or something that is like stopping violent behavior. It's like hey, this person has substance abuse issues. Let's get them, in touch with, with a rehab center. If someone's having issues with being unhoused, we need to get them in a center for this. So it's so interesting to me that we're talking about like literally a matter of life and death, but it doesn't even have to be. But it's not even about violence.
Yeah, it's not about it's I am trying to go to the worst case scenario and work my way backwards, right?
Mhm.
And if we can prevent violence, whether it is self-inflicted or onto others or both, is the absolute worst outcome that we can possibly have. If we work backwards from that,
Mhm.
we can get all kinds of different issues solved using the same strategies and methodologies that we're using for the worst case. I'll give you a
Mhm.
great instance, couple of great little case studies here. I work with a lot of different states. One of the states that I work with, and I've made this public, and they've also published it, so it's I'm not throwing them under the bus. But the state of Vermont went and did a study on everybody that committed suicide within their state within a calendar year.
Mhm.
And they found out that something like 96% of the people that committed suicide that year had were entered into at least one social state program that they were getting assistance for.
Mhm.
78% of those people within a calendar year that committed suicide were in 3 or more different systems. Okay. Now, you can look at that, and obviously they did, as a huge failure on the systems.
Mhm.
I look at it just slightly different. One, the people that need assistance are not unknown entities. This goes back to sort of the idea of that we have to prepare for random acts of violence, that this just sort of pops up in our face. It doesn't. We know who they are. Okay.
Mhm.
Two, there is no interconnectivity amongst our the programs and institutions that are designed to help us. Okay. They are single tracked. You do not just become homeless. There are a lot of different factors that
Mhm.
lead up to you becoming homeless, right? The same sort of, and I think that study really highlights the lack of connectivity amongst sort of the institutions that we hold accountable or responsible for helping us out in our time of need, right?
Mhm.
You get this sort of, this is my lane, this is my issue, and I will deal with just that issue. But as it's shown, if you have a 78, let's say 78% failure rate, okay, you're not looking at the whole being. You're just taking one little slice of something, trying to mitigate that, but it's not doing anything for all the other things.
Mhm.
And um, so there's a way in which the coordinated sort of prevention way of approach of doing things is, the data is there.
Mhm.
Worked with states that could tell you, hey, if you're a first-time recipient of food stamps, we've got analytics that can tell you from the month, week, and day that person is going to show up for food assistance, right? And we've done this weird thing where we've put the onus on the person in crisis to
Mhm.
navigate through our system of help, rather than the system of help sort of surrounding that individual and
Mm.
providing them with all the options that they potentially might have. They just want to get through the day. They just either want to
Right.
get their food for the day, or they want some shelter for that day. They do not know or have the capacity to know that in 2 months, 3 weeks, and a day, this new thing is going to come into their life
Right.
that is going to be a massive thing. And
Well, it
so,
goes back I'm sorry.
yeah,
It
go
it
ahead.
goes
Go ahead.
back to what you and I were talking about earlier. If you don't have basic like your sustenance issues met, or your housing, you are not going to be thinking with your prefrontal cortex. You're going to be in the amygdala of like fight or flight the whole time.
Right.
How in the
Yeah.
You're
You're
not
just
going to
in
be
fight or
able to
flight, just
do
dealing
anything.
with the immediate need.
Right.
And that goes also back to what we were talking about, like from a security standpoint of bringing that water down to more stillness,
Mhm.
right? If you are in a posture, just like, you said, like you're in a fight or flight, if you have protection measures and you are doing preparedness measures, you are in a state where you are ready to go, right? You are
Mhm.
looking for things to initiate a response, or you are waiting for something to happen. So you are on
Mhm.
high alert. So you are going to naturally gravitate your attention to those things that are right in front of your face. And you might be missing things that are happening on the periphery that are far more dangerous and far more easier to intercede
Mhm.
on, because your attention is so locked in on this type one thing. Um, I go to schools and I'll often say, like, is that kid in the corner, is that just a quiet kid, or is that a kid that's in like the death grip of isolation? Like, show me tell me
Mhm.
what the difference is. And they're like, well, he's never or she's never a problem. Well, yeah, because she's not screaming or he's not
Right.
screaming at you in front of your face. Like, how are you making that assessment that they're not a problem just because they're not they're
Mhm.
not speaking up in class, or they're not acting out like this other person
Yeah.
is?
Well, and I kind of that goes back to what sorry to what you and I were talking about earlier. When I was talking about like I would ignore the anger and push it down. And so somebody just because somebody is not exhibiting outward signs of being angry or feeling isolated certainly does not mean that they aren't feeling that way.
Right.
And so I think
Absolutely.
that it's very important that, kind of you've made too many good points during this interview. I'm sorry.
No problem. No
but
problem.
but we need to go back to before, whenever you like before you're even noticing the substance use issues, where you're like, hey, this person, it seems like they're kind of having like housing issues, they're having to move around and stuff. If we can get the handle on that first.
Yeah, and I think there again, everything in sort of moderation. I think one of the things that is a natural tendency to do is to look at certain risk factors and sort of check off the boxes and believe that because they are checking off certain risk factors, that then therefore they have a higher probability of violent behavior or substance abuse or something like that. To an extent, that might be true,
Mhm.
but your internal biases are going to be imposed on that. That is the one
Mhm.
problem with evaluating risk factors as a predictor of certain behaviors, right? Because risk factors are often looked at from a outside in lens,
Mhm.
right? Like, oh, they're from a poor area, or oh, there's a very strong gun culture in that area. those individuals might not look at it as a risk factor. They might look at it as just sort of life, right?
Yeah.
And so they are not at any disadvantage or more probability of going down a pathway than anybody else. And you can see this with shooters where there really isn't, from a risk factor profile, it goes all over the place. There's people who are rich, there's people who are poor, there are people who are of different races, different genders, everything else. And so focusing a lot on the risk factors is going to sort of lead you down, is going to preempt, sort of lead you down a pathway, and focus your attention on things that might not need their focused.
Yeah.
When you focus in on the behaviors, when you takes the biases sort of out. What are you actually doing? And are you sort of checking off that pathway of violence behavioral checklist rather than the risk factor checklist? Those behavioral indicators are far more predictive than any risk factor that you'll have.
I think one of the big things that I had gotten from that was that what we said earlier, the identity, the community, the purpose, that those three things, they don't know a community or a socioeconomic demographic. Those are those are everywhere. That is a human that's a human issue. So if we're looking only at external things, we have completely missed the point.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I think, again, the other weird thing about, looking at it from a security standpoint and just trying to be more human centric within the security field is that human beings are terrible at assigning value.
Mm.
We have no idea what the value of anything is. And in fact, it's why The Price is Right has been on TV for as long as it has, because it's a never-ending cycle. You can just replay the same episode almost all the time, which they do, because human beings will not know the difference between how much a dishwasher is worth, or how much they're willing to pay for a car or an all expense paid vacation. Like there's an endless thing. The weird intrinsic value, or the value that has been sort of optimized around theoretical value within the protection and preparedness realm rather than the prevention realm, is always a fascinating thing to me. The idea that you will get pushback of, well, we don't really want to do prevention because then how would we measure its success? Right?
Yeah.
And
That's a good point.
yeah, my pushback to that is like, well, what is your return on investment on the cameras? What is your return on investment on the bulletproof glass on the windows and things like that? Like, is your metric just because something didn't happen, that it all of a sudden justifies the cost of it? And what if, and so therefore, if we're trying to make a logical, argument of, okay, we're going to value X amount of dollars for protection measures, but we could do 1/4 of that cost for prevention, but we won't, because why? There's there's a very odd dynamic that we have, and I believe there is something sort of just more tangible in seeing guards, and there's a narrative around it. If you go on any college campus, you'll see these sort of like these blue light towers, these telephone towers that are all over the place. So what's interesting about those, and this goes right to sort of like the psychological value of security and what it is. Basically now every single college campus has a security app that students can download right onto their smartphone. Some of these you can live text with a police officer or campus security. Some of them are geolocated. They have a geolocation option. Some of them even go so far as you can upload your class schedule, so that if you ping that you're in, you need security to come, and typically between 11:30 in the morning and 12:30 in the afternoon, you're in X class on the third floor, et cetera, et cetera. That'll pop up. So instead of just going to the building, they'll know exactly what floor and what room that distress call is coming. Far superior light years ahead of just this static tower box, right? That you would have to call and wait for somebody to respond, right?
Yeah.
Colleges have tried to remove those phone towers and have been basically backed down by the student population, have been yelled down. There is an emotional attachment. There is something tangible, irregardless of the effectiveness of it. There is something that when we see it, there's a narrative. And colleges that have a lot of those, the narrative is that we are serious about your safety. Even though I've created something that is in your pocket that you hold on all the time, that is far superior to this outdated relic, there is something within the brain that is attached to that has a narrative around that you are taking like this seriously. And that's just a weird thing within the security realm, because what you will see is you'll see universities or different things that will add more security cameras or will add more security personnel onto campus, and the exact reverse reaction happens, where they feel like their rights are being infringed. They feel that because there's more armed security around, that there's the dynamic of the environment completely changes. And it kind of goes back to that experience I had at the liquor store, where, okay, this is an unsafe environment. You have, armed security guards walking all over the place. I can't walk 5 feet without seeing some sort of security camera, taking a stand in my face, and for what reason and everything else. So there's, again, security.
So fascinating.
The security and the human element of it doesn't follow logic.
Yeah.
And when we try to impose logical solutions to sort of more psychological and emotional problems, there becomes a major disconnect in how we interact within that environment. And I do find that sort of really interesting to explore with my clients, of sort of, okay, what is it that you want to achieve here, right? And what are you doing that's actually counterproductive? One of the things that we often see is, you got to go through metal detectors while you're already in the building, right? The idea that you'll see success rates of like, well, we instituted this metal detector and we caught this student and he was bringing knives to school, right? And the question isn't like, oh, great, well, you got the knife. The question is more like, why did they want to bring a knife to school, right? That is something that you determine before they get through the metal detector, right? That is one of the things that I've preached to a bunch of schools, is sort of this doorman fallacy. A lot of schools, they'll have like the buses will come up and the students will come out, and there's nobody there from the school welcoming the students in, right? You just go in and then you go through your security measures as you're sort of in there. The doorman fallacy is that the doorman is just there to sort of like open the door, right? And when in actuality, there's a whole dynamic between having the doorman there. One, the doorman is a first line of security. The doorman is a dynamic security. So the doorman can see if, a stranger walks by and can identify, yeah, that was the same guy that walked by here on Wednesday. Why is he here? And having that sort of weird sort of sixth sense of that there's something wrong there. They're also taking a temperature check of everybody that's coming into the building, right? They're trying to strike up a conversation. Hey, how you doing? Are you doing good? And you can get body language off of that. So one of the things that I do with the schools is I encourage the staff to sort of go out at that time if they can and just say hello to the kids. How you doing? Scan who might be getting teased, who might be just looking a little low, whose body language is right. That's all security stuff, and that's also good prevention.
Yeah, I was about to say that's helping it like keep the community intact.
Right.
If you have that teacher reaching out, it's doing kind of two things
bus
there.
drivers. What did you see? What was going on? You see, I mentioned that incident where they said, "Oh yeah, we think that there's, he's getting picked up or dropped off at the same thing." That's not something that often gets shared unprovoked, right? Like that's not something that the bus driver necessarily felt was necessary to tell anybody until there was a person there having a conversation with the bus drivers. Hey, what did you see? Is there some behavior that's going on the ride there? Are there students that look, like they're having a tough time or everything else, so that you can address it then and there, so that it's not, you're not waiting for that threshold to all of a sudden get crossed and then all of your response measures have to go into play.
So
yeah,
this seems like a no-brainer for any school, jurisdiction, you name it. What are some hurdles that you've encountered?
So the hurdles are just nobody that I have spoken to or presented in front of or anything like that has ever said to me, "Yeah, this ain't it." Right? Like,
yeah.
we don't really agree with this. Also, to that, adding behavioral threat assessment and management, otherwise known as BTAM. There's a whole host of different strategies of BTAM. Most are good with the assessment. We'll teach you with the assessment. It is the management that is really the kicker. And it is the one that actually has the most technical stuff that has to be done. And so there are certain people. There's a great woman, Dr. Emma Cardelli. Oh, my light just went out. Dr. Emma Cardelli, she's out of Boston Children's Hospital. She has created a thing for clinicians on how to manage people with violent ideation. This is getting a little bit into the weeds, but I think it's good for your audience to know. Most clinicians, certified clinicians, do not get any type of instruction on violent ideation, how to manage violent ideation. It is typically piecemealed between substance abuse management strategies and suicide management strategies. And so there are specific nuances with people that have violent ideation that the management is a little bit different. And so I'm not a certified clinician or doctor or anything else, so I don't do that part of the training.
Right.
But in saying that, instituting behavioral threat assessment teams, or what I like to call care teams, I think there's a much better way of looking at it from a prevention lens. Again, we had talked about, those one-off incidents that don't really go to a threat assessment team, right? Or don't feel like they rise to the level of a threat.
Right.
Where if you categorize it as sort of a care team, that encompasses all kinds of different things, minor and major incidents and things like that. So any place, whether it's a workplace or a school or even a town, we're starting to see town-wide behavioral threat assessment teams or care teams being developed. Nobody who has instituted that has ever dissolved that team. Okay, so once you've inserted it, you're locked in, and everybody has raved about it, about how effective it is. But it's really the coordination that you are trying to achieve with that is nipping things really early on, getting interceding where it needs to be at an appropriate time, way in advance before any of that kind of happens. And so it's talking to towns and stuff like that. The hurdle is that these types of programs and the way in which they do business is so entrenched that there is, and it goes back to sort of the identity, community, and the purpose, right? It says on the side of cop cars, protect and serve, not prevent and serve, right? And so that whole sector and system is designed with the protection and preparedness / response methodology in there. We've already talked about mental and public health programs and how they are kind of stovepiped to a singular issue and how they don't necessarily look outside of their issue. Now, there might be networks within that system, but systems are generally very, very rigid.
Yeah.
They don't offer a lot of flexibility. And then the networks within those have usually single points of failure where it is one person that, is taking the initiative to reach out. But as soon as that person leaves, the whole network kind of like collapse amongst itself. So really the stumbling block is looking at this long term. What you want is not a system or even a network to be developed. What you want is that this becomes just the way you do business.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That whether it is within a school district, whether it is in a school, whether it is in an office, however you want, however small or however big you want to make it, this is just how you operate with different types of information and how you just sort of examine and assess the people that are within your environment. There's a great story that's kind of an analogy that I used between Toyota and Mercedes. And so this is actually a pretty interesting story. So back in sort of like the late 70s, early 80s, the most reliable car on the market was, I think it was like a Mercedes AMG Roadster or something like that. And the 1A to that Roadster was the Toyota Corolla. And nobody within the auto industry could figure out how Toyota was making this car that was just as reliable as the Mercedes at 1/3 the price. And what ended up sort of happening was a deep dive into just the processes of how Mercedes manufactured their cars, where there was a huge emphasis on training and bringing the technical aspects of everything. Took years and years to sort of master and training and an apprenticeship and everything else. And then there was like a 2,000 point inspection once it left the manufacturing garage before it hit the lot, right? And for that, you paid a premium, all right? Because you had to keep these experts on staff and you had a lot of training and everything else. Toyota did none of that. Toyota didn't have an inspection. Their employees on the line weren't really highly trained. In fact, they moved them from different parts onto on the line, doing different things. But what Toyota did that was so different was they put their quality control not at the back end, but they inserted it across the whole manufacturing. They integrated their quality control throughout the manufacturing process. And so what they did was they created really a culture of prevention. They encouraged everybody on that line to, if there was something, no matter how minor or how major, they could stop the manufacturing, the line right then and there. And somebody would come over and they would say the problem, and they may end up having to call somebody out that from the previous team that worked on something. But what they did was they created a culture where that person, yeah, you made a mistake. Okay. But in 2 months' time, that person that made the mistake might find that you made a mistake.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they created this really formidable culture that was, 1/3 the price, and it was throughout the whole manufacturing, and they achieved, one of the most reliable cars on the market.
Mhm.
Now, from a security standpoint, it's kind of the same. Listen, Mercedes did have a reliable car, right? Like, they just had a premium on it. It isn't that, the protection and the preparedness and the response things don't work, or that your response after that threshold has been crossed, that you don't have your 2,000 point inspection and can't get a reliable car out onto the market, right? You
Mhm.
can do that. However, you know, it takes so much more effort, and you are essentially threading a needle, and it is way more expensive to do that than to just integrate your prevention protocols into the manufacturing process, where
Mhm.
you always have these checkpoints. There's no punishment or anything else for getting it wrong or for calling somebody out. We're not trying to snitch on anybody, because they all looked at themselves as, we're all trying to keep ourselves, we're all trying to make the best car here. We're
Mhm.
all in this together. If you're having a problem, I might have a problem later on, and everything else. And so that's really that integration of just how you do business is really what I'm trying to get installed at all different levels. Because as we've mentioned numerous times, none of this is random, right? None of these acts are just these pop-off events that had no lead up or were just a complete surprise to everybody. So if there's one thing that I want the listeners and the viewers of the podcast to understand, is do not fall for the random acts of violence. There is no random act of violence, whether it is a shooting, mass shooting, or whether it is a road rage incident out on the highway. There is always the grievances, there's the lead up, there's the assessment, the evaluation and acquisition and everything else. There's all these death by 1,000 paper cuts that lead to the character arc of this sort of explosion of violent behavior. And so that's the real mission here, is trying to get people not just on board, but to just shift their framework, and their perception of what they want out of security, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
in is what we're doing, is the return on investment, if that's the metric that we're going to be sort of judging everything on, is that the correct metric for
Mm.
what we are trying to achieve?
If my listeners are wanting to find out more information about you, where can they find you?
So TVTP, Targeted Violence Terrorism Prevention Solutions. Our website has a contact page. They
Okay.
can contact me. I'll do a
That will be
virtual.
link in the bio.
Yep. And I can do virtual trainings. I can do in-person trainings. I can do trainings specifically to a certain audience. So if you are more looking for an education bent or a mental health and public health bent, or even a law enforcement bent, I am able to sort of navigate through those waters with you to
Mhm.
make it the most bang for your buck. I also have a YouTube page, which you can sort of link to through the website, and everything else has interviews just like this that I've done, as well as some educational, small, 5 to 7 minute documentary type things about certain specific things within the prevention field, whether that be a case study or just sort of a reframing
Mhm.
of what prevention is. So I just encourage everybody to, don't be a stranger. And if you want me to talk or present something, I'm happy to do so.
I just have one more question, and it's
Yeah.
purely for vanity purposes. Those other interviews, they weren't as good as this one, right?
No, Certainly not as in depth. No. So I appreciate this interview, and again, Adam, I really appreciate just giving me the platform and allowing me to do this, because there's ways to do this top down, and I feel like this is more of a bottom up type of thing. I know I've spit out a lot of different a lot of information, kind of drinking from the fire hose here, but
Well, they can listen a couple of times. That'll be
there you
okay.
go. But I really think I think going back to sort of that Toyota model, I think what they really realized was you don't need to be a trained professional in order to do this. That if you look at it from a holistic standpoint, every single person has the ability to see behaviors, notify appropriate people, even do something as simple as the power of hello. If you are not feeling like capable of doing a negotiation or an intervention or anything like that, you don't need, I'm not looking for intervention specialists. All I'm looking for is for people to recognize when somebody is potentially struggling and seeing if there's a way that they can help. And it's amazing what can happen if you just take that little step, irregardless of what your background is or your training or anything else. There was a huge campaign a while back about the power of hello. And, going back to what I was, the part in my talk where I let people just kind of do a grievance dump for about a minute. It's amazing how better people feel knowing that they get something off their chest and there's no judgment and there's a person out there that is concerned about their well-being and doesn't want to impose their thoughts or their biases or have a debate or anything else. Just let them know that if you need any help, you've got at least one person that you can call or talk to or something like that. And it's amazing how effective that is. And so there is a lot of technical expertise and a lot of terminologies and methodologies and strategies and everything else. But really at the core, it is just a human to human kind of hello, how are you? Is there anything I can do? Is there anything you need? Can we help? Anything like that, how far that goes before you get to any of that technical stuff.
Robert, man, this was freaking awesome. I've had a blast talking to you, man. Thank you so much for acting out with me.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear it.